When Jesus entered the temple, the chief priest and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will also ask you one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they argued with one another. "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' He answered, 'I will not.' But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said to the same. And he answered, 'I go, sir.' But he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father?" They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Perhaps 25 years ago, after Jan and the kids and I had moved to Iowa City from Holy Comforter, where I was the rector of Trinity Church, there was one particular Sunday, it was in December, and I remember I had preached all 3 of the liturgies. I had led the adult forum. I had also helped facilitate a group of people to go out and sing Christmas carols at 3 different nursing homes, and then went to the organ recital offered by the head of the organ department, who was a member of the parish. Now, at this church, which was then about the size that Holy Comforter is now, I was the only priest. I had retired and non-parochial clergy who helped out, but I was the only full-time priest in a church that needed at least 2. So I just was throwing myself in everything, killing myself. And that night I got home, and Jan, knowing how much I loved my children, how devoted I was to my family, how much I talked about the importance of family, Jan just looked at me and said, "You know, you don't actually live here, you just sleep here." Ow. Ow. Talk about a wake-up call, huh? I mean, I was eager. I was a young priest. It was the first time I'd been a rector. I wanted to do a good job. I wanted everybody to like me. I wanted to fulfill the ministry to which I'd been called. But I was also a husband and father. And I had gotten things out of balance, things out of skew, out of whack. And she called me back in that summons to remember who I was completely, not just as a priest. You don't really live here, you just sleep here. It was a wake-up call. We got a wake-up call today, too, don't we, in our gospel? It's a fairly familiar moment, and if you remember, this comes right during the very last days of Jesus' life, as Matthew describes it. Right before this, in the preceding couple of days, Jesus has borrowed a donkey in order to ride into the holy city on what we now call Palm Sunday. As the crowds cheered and yelled and waved palm branches and threw those branches and their cloaks on the road to strew them before him as he rode in. He then, of course, goes into the temple precincts, and there he turns over the tables of the moneylenders, and he throws the merchants out of the temple precincts. He curses a fig tree that has not borne fruit. It's been a busy couple of days. And he has received both the adulation of the crowd and the criticism of the religious and civic authorities and leaders. And when we get into today's gospel, he has returned to the temple in order to preach and teach. And once he arrives, the religious leaders come up to him and say, "Who do you think you are? What gives you the right? What gives you the authority to do all these things, to do the teaching and the preaching, to throw out the moneylenders and the merchants? Who do you think you are?" And of course, Jesus, as he so often does, answers their question with a question. Okay, do you think that the baptism of John was from heaven or was it from man? And of course, they go and confer and they take a sort of a namby-pamby middle road. We're not sure. And then Jesus tells them the short parable we hear today, the parable of the two sons, or the parable of the yes and no brothers, as it's sometimes called. On the one hand, we have the yes brother who says, "Yes, Father, I will go work in the field as you have requested," but then instead he goes and he watches, college football or Game of Thrones. Then we have the brother who says, "No, I will not go work, Father," but he goes out and does the work his father has asked him to do. And Jesus, of course, says to the Pharisees, the scribes who are questioning him, which one did the will of the Father? And of course, the answer is obvious. The one who said, "No, I'm not going to go," but then actually does the work, because as we all know, as even the Pharisees and scribes knew, actions speak louder than words. And then, of course, there's the rub. So far, so good. But it's when Jesus says, "I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into heaven before you." Talk about how to make friends and influence people. If there had been an inquest into Jesus' death after the crucifixion, this moment would probably have been pointed out as one of the turning moments, the turning points, because you simply can't talk to the authorities in that way. One side note, by the way, Jesus does not say to them, "The tax collectors and the prostitutes will go into heaven instead of you." He simply says, "ahead of you." In other words, there's still the opportunity. There's still the option. There's still the possibility for those tax collectors, for those leaders, those religious and civic leaders, to avail themselves of the kingdom message that Jesus is proclaiming. So in essence, this gospel, this parable, is a wake-up call to those religious leaders as well. The other people, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the bums, the scoundrels, the scummiest of the scummiest and the lowest of the low, the people with whom Jesus spent so much of his time, they knew their need for God. They knew their need to change directions. They knew their hunger for a right relationship with the Holy One. They knew their desire to be enfolded in God's grace. But when everything is going fine, when everything seems to be working well, as it was for the religious leaders and authorities, the hunger for God can become abated and softened. And Jesus, I think, in this parable is saying to them, time to wake up, time to re-up, time to turn from the ways that had led you away from God to re-embrace God's holy kingdom. But of course, most of them, maybe all of them, refuse to do so. And this moment, along with so many other parallel moments, leads to his death. But this parable, to me, reminds us that Jesus constantly sounds the invitation again and again and again to relinquish whatever it is that is keeping us from God's love, to let go of whatever it is that is blocking our journey into the heart of God, whatever is keeping us from enjoying the full and abundant life of which Jesus speaks and which he offers. There are two kinds of parables, by the way. There are the parables that are called window parables, where we are given some analogy or metaphor that gives us a window into reality. Those are the parables like, the kingdom of God is like. the pearl of great value, the shepherd who goes to seek the one sheep that's gotten lost and leaves the 99 behind. Those are windows into. Then there are parables that are called mirror parables, where the story is held up right in front of us and we are supposed to see ourselves in the story. And that's what we get today, where Jesus is saying to us basically, are you a yes brother or a no brother? Does your life reflect, he says to the Pharisees and the scribes, the leaders, does your life reflect what you espouse, what you say you believe? Because the truth is, there isn't a creed, there isn't a mission statement in the world worth a single visit to a sick friend or a cup of water for someone who's thirsty. And how we live our faith, how we put skin on who we are and what we believe and the one in whom we live is much more important than all the creeds and all the mission statements in the world. Today is basically a call to respond. Not just a condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees, because Jesus leaves the door open for them to enter into the kingdom of heaven. It's a call to turn, to change, to reorient, to refocus, to rebalance our lives and the way we direct them toward God. When I was a very young priest, knew a very old priest, a man who'd been ordained in 1928. And his first assignment right out of seminary was to be the vicar of a small town church here in the rural Midwest. And it happened to him something that all clergy who are new to a church fear. A couple weeks after he arrived, a member of the parish died. Someone he didn't know, and he had to do her funeral. And as he began to ask around the church and around the town, he couldn't find a single good story about her. She didn't come to church very often. Her husband was an engineer on the railroad, so he was gone a lot of the time. She rented out rooms in the house, and there was some suspicion she rented out more than that. And no one had anything good to say about this woman. And then the priest went into the little, small town general store and was talking to the proprietor and sort of bemoaning the fact that he didn't really have anything good to say about Gladys. And the proprietor paused and seemed to be trying to make up his mind. And then he reached underneath, it's a true story told to me by this elderly priest, and he pulled out his register of accounts. And putting his hand over the names of the people in the book, he showed the young priest in red all of the credits that he had extended to people where there'd been a family sickness or a death or where the husband was drinking the income away, how much they had accrued in credit, in debt. And the red line through each one, because he said Gladys, at the end of every month, would come in and ask who owed what. And she'd pay it for them. She wanted to be completely anonymous, but I figure now that she's dead, since no one has anything good to say about her, including the people who benefited from her generosity, I can reveal the truth. A rather different funeral took place the next day, as you might imagine. The point is, who are we when no one is watching? Who are we as people of God, as followers of Jesus, when we're not sure anybody is paying attention? There's another wonderful story. If you've ever seen the movie, or more specifically read the book Out of Africa by Isaac Dinesen, she talks in the book about a young boy who comes to work in her house named Kitao. He works for her for about 3 months, and he's a very good, diligent worker. And after 3 months, he comes to her and says that he wants a letter of recommendation to a Muslim sheikh in Mombasa. And she's a little distressed, and she said, well, I'll pay you more money. I'd love to have you stay. And he tells her, well, no. He said, I decided that I'm going to determine whether I'm going to be a Christian or a Muslim based on how people live. So I have come to live with you for 3 months to see how Christians behave, and now I want to go see how Muslims behave. And Isaac Dinesen writes, I think even an archbishop would have said or thought what I said, which was, good God, Kitao, you could have told me that when you arrived. Who are we when we're not sure anybody's watching? Are we the yes brother? Are we the no brother? And today, like every day, like that moment 2,000 years ago when Jesus confronted the religious leaders, like that Sunday evening in Iowa City when Jan called me out, so to speak. Today is a moment where we are given once again, as God always does, another chance, another opportunity, another moment. Paul Tillich, the great theologian in the last century, preached a famous sermon titled and focusing on the concept of the eternal now. Isn't that a great idea? The eternal now. That every moment, is an opportunity to turn again, to approach God again, to open up to God again, to be embraced by God's love, to seek to be the child who does what God desires and asks, to live into our identity. Today, Sunday morning, in Kenilworth here on the North Shore, we're given yet again a chance to turn and give our lives to the one who's given us life.